discussing, as I said, finishing up the early republic, and then I'll transition and talk about the rise of American democracy. So today I'm going to start with the slideshow called the Republic, and this will correspond to the end of Chapter 7 of American Yop and Chapter 8, and then I'll discuss subjects from Chapter 9. So if you have that slideshow up, the early republic, that is, I'm going to pick up with what I'm going to do, first of all, is for the purposes of time, skip over a slide that's called Embargo and Foreign Controversy. It's about the War of 1812. It's significant, but I just want to keep wheels moving. So the War of 1812, you can certainly read more about that in Chapter 7 of American Yop. That won't be on the final exam because I've chosen to not discuss it myself. So no need to worry about it, but I'll just say briefly that it's a war that was the culmination of about 10 years worth of foreign controversy over which had a background in the Napoleonic Wars, and President Thomas Jefferson and later James Madison attempted to prevent the United States from entering a war against Great Britain, most importantly, which failed. The War of 1812 was fought against Great Britain, and it was inconclusive. A war which neither side ultimately gained very much, certainly in terms of territorial exchanges. But I want to just move forward and talk about what for me is the end of the period called the Early Republic. And you'll see that American Yop ends the era called the Early Republic with the War of 1812. I actually ended, if you go to a slide called the Missouri Crisis and Compromise, with the Missouri Crisis and the Missouri Compromise, which for me is a fitting end to this first several decades of United States history after the creation and ratification of the Constitution. So when I'm looking at that slide, again, titled The Missouri Crisis and Compromise, and for me this is the end of this period of the early republic, because it signifies the first time that we in United States history have a major conflict over the question of slavery and its westward expansion. And this has to do with Missouri, a territory much of which became the state of Missouri, and also to a lesser degree Maine, if you're looking at the first bullet point, in 1819 and 1820. Most of this discussion will be about Missouri because it was the first state after 1803 and the Louisiana Purchase, which was carved out of the Louisiana Territory, which we talked about last week. And if you scroll up, you want to remind yourself, there's a map about 10 slides up that has, again, we talked about this last week, but a map of the territory of the Louisiana Purchase. And if you look at that map with the big green territory that is Louisiana Purchase, you can see a label called Missouri Country right in the center of it. So we're talking about that territory there. Again, most of which is today the state of Missouri. So that's the first territory which applied to become a state in the United States, carved out of that large chunk of territory. And the question that generated so much controversy was whether or not it could be a free state or a slave state. At that time, in 1819, when the territory of Missouri applied to become a state, it had a population of about 60,000 in total, and about of that 60,000, about 12,000 were enslaved people. So there's a pretty significant slave population. Much of the immigrants who had moved to Missouri had come from already existing slave states, especially those of Kentucky, Louisiana, and Tennessee, which you can see border the Missouri territory, that map section called Missouri Country. And when that state's leaders applied to become a state in the United States, they applied to become a slave state, thinking that the process would be more or less rubber stamped. They didn't foresee any complications, except for the fact that in Congress, which had to approve its application to become a state, to the surprise of slaveholding politicians, we see a very significant pushback against the idea by northern congressmen from free states against the idea that Missouri should become a slave state. They demanded that Missouri become a free state. And this touched off 2 years worth of intense conflict in Congress and in the press. And it generated, again, the first major conflict over slavery's future and therefore and most importantly, whether or not it could expand. And it generated two responses, a Southern pro-slavery response, a pro-slavery view of the Constitution, which on the slide is called pro-slavery constitutionalism, and a Northern response an anti-slavery view of the Constitution called anti-slavery constitutionalism on the slide. So the Southern response is simply that the United States government was created primarily to allow United States citizens, and when I say government, I mean the Constitution was created and ratified with the primary understanding that the government exists to protect private property. And for slaveholders, as we know, enslaved people themselves were private property. Therefore, the United States government could never prevent slavery from expanding. The United States government must allow slavery to expand. The response of Northerners, anti-slavery constitutionalism, is a very different view of the Constitution and therefore of the primary purpose of the American government, and that is that the United States government was created to protect. Not to protect, but to promote the expansion of freedom, primarily. And according to that view, the United States government must prevent slavery from expanding. So here we have two diametrically opposed views, a view of the Constitution and the government as protecting property, and the other as promoting the expansion of freedom, that butted heads in 1819 and 1820. As we'll see moving forward over the next few weeks, this fundamental conflict would continue to arise, especially in the 1830s and the 1840s. And this is the traditional beginning point for historians of the events that would ultimately, 40 years later, in 1860 and 1861, lead to the American Civil War. In this context of the Missouri crisis, we find that a compromise is reached, which is the last point, the resolution. And that resolution, if you scroll down past to the very last slide, to a map with the blue and red and yellow colors, is called the Missouri Compromise Line. It's a 3630 parallel that is a latitude and longitude, and it's the green line or the latitude, and you can see that on the map is the green line. So the compromise decided that this imaginary green line, which borders the southern border of Missouri, which you can see in the middle of the map, in the future above that line to the north, so all the states that you can see primarily in blue, as the country expanded westward, those states on the west coast above the green line would, by definition, must be free states, so slavery would be illegal in them. Whereas to the south of that line, below that line, future states, including Texas, you can see there, would be free states. So the idea was to split the country in half between free states and slave states. And this compromise was widely seen as a permanent solution to this problem of slavery and expansion. But as we'll see, it lasted 34 years. That's something we'll get to in a couple of weeks when we discuss that time period. So this is, for me, the traditional end of the end of the early Republic period. And I want to wrap up now talking about the early American economy, which is the last slide with text that you can see in this slideshow. And this slide boils down the themes that are discussed in Chapter 8 of American Yop, a chapter called The Market Revolution, because I think it's helpful at this point to sort of take a step back and think about the economic change that we've seen from the late 18th century until about 1820, right around the period of the Missouri crisis. And what we have here are three economic revolutions that collectively transformed the early American economy and really set it on a path towards the economic development that has led us to where we are today, for better or worse, in the 21st century. But these three complementary revolutions, the market revolution, the industrial revolution, and the transportation revolution, most importantly had a significant impact on the free states of the North, much less so on the slave states of the South, for reasons that I'll talk about subsequently, and not next week, but the week after, in discussing the subject of Chapter 11 of American Yop, which is the Cotton Revolution. So this slide, the early American economy, is a discussion that is most importantly applied to the northern free states, because the northern free states underwent three, and in this order, market revolution, industrial revolution, transportation revolution, but three chronologically in order, but linked, related revolutions that fundamentally transformed the United States. And most importantly, what these revolutions did, if we were to break it down very, very simply, is make the United States a capitalist nation. This capitalism, the economic system in which we currently live, really began to emerge powerfully in the northern states of the United States right after the American Revolution, and really escalating through the first several decades of the 19th century. So this first revolution is the name of a chapter of American Op. It's called the Market Revolution. What this was is, you see the term, the capitalist transformation of the countryside. What that describes is a process by which, after the American Revolution, people living in agrarian, agricultural, rural areas of the free states of the North, which encompassed about 90% of the northern population. At this time, only about 10% of the northern population lived in urban areas. So the vast majority of people lived in agricultural areas, and they depended on agriculture for their survival, for their subsistence. What began to change is that people living outside of cities in northern agrarian areas began to undergo a shift from subsistence farming, in which typically farm families produced most of what they needed to survive, or were able to acquire it through local trade, to having to produce crops to sell to external markets in order to survive. So it's a shift from a very localized, home-based economy to relying on producing crops to sell to both markets in growing cities in the East Coast, but also internationally. And so this was a major shift from being able to produce what one needed to live, or one's family, or be able to acquire it from neighbors, for example, to having to depend on external, outside markets. Really had fundamental changes in the way that people experience their economic lives. It had both positive and negative drawbacks. It had positive effects and some drawbacks and negative effects. Positive effects meant that because the market for agricultural produce began to expand, what that meant was that people were able to, by selling their crops, selling their farm produce in exchange for cash, were able to purchase consumer goods that made life more comfortable to live. So people's standard of living in many cases rose as a result of this market revolution.